fight that? The Democrats fight that. President Biden announces for re-election, and where does he go immediately? To wealthy donors. He goes to Wall Street. This is both parties. Come on. This is why the rich don't pay taxes. So we're on a spiraling rise of debt. You can carry some debt. We all, carry a mortgage maybe if you own a home. Some people have consumer debt and so forth, but you keep it under a limit so that it doesn't get out of hand. And for a while, the interest rates were very, very low. So the government said, oh, look, we can borrow. It doesn't matter. We'll just keep borrowing. But you know what? It turned into inflation. Now the interest rates are going up because the Fed is once again raising interest rates to try to staunch inflation. And suddenly the debt service burden, in other words, how much we have to pay on just interest on this debt, is rising by percentage points of GDP, eating up invaluable tax revenues that we need to help educate our kids, for normal society, for fighting the pandemics and the mental health and the crime and other things that we have a social safety net for. But it's now going to go to debt service. And that is why you keep your debt under control, so that when you collect revenues, you can use it for the important things, not simply to pay interest on what you borrowed in the past.
Now, when we're paying this interest, Jeffrey Sachs, are we paying this interest to Japan, a large holder of U.S. debt, to China, another large holder of U.S. debt? Did they buy treasury bonds? Is that the debt that we're talking about?
Yeah, we pay the interest on anyone that holds U.S. Treasury bills and bonds. That includes a lot of foreign governments, as you've mentioned. It includes a lot of wealthy people in the United States. It includes a lot of pension funds, insurance funds, money market funds backed up by U.S. Treasury bills. The government borrows by selling its bills and bonds in a kind of open market that any wealth holder can buy to include in their wealth or their asset portfolio. So it's wealth holders all over the world of all kinds, from pension funds and insurance funds and money market funds and foreign exchange reserves of other governments. The point from our governmental point of view is that's okay if it's 35% of GDP, even if it's 50% of GDP. By the way, it's okay if it went up to 100% of GDP and we had used the difference for making wonderful investments that were going to boost the economy. But where did that increase of debt come from? That 16 trillion that I talked about, what was it used for? Was it used for modernizing our infrastructure and making everything work well in the US? No, it went to wars, down the drain. It went to the veterans spending for all the wounded soldiers that suffered from this, a huge bill, human disaster, financial and fiscal disaster. It went also for this Wall Street debacle in 2008 when they were playing games with subprime mortgages, and we ended up with a massive recession. And it went to the spending on the COVID pandemic. And so we don't have the infrastructure or the investment, the physical capital, as the counterpart of all that borrowing. We have a lot of waste. It's very sad. We ran up the debt and we have nothing to show for it except, my God, why did we do that?
Well, I think we did it because the capital has really been invaded by lobbyists for military contractors. They're the most powerful, as you mentioned in your article in Common Dreams, the most powerful lobbying group. I imagine the oil industry, fossil fuel industry is right up there as well with big pharma. But by and large, we have a captive Congress. So here's my question. To talk about the debt just a little bit more, with us owing something like over $800 billion in interest to China, how is it that we have all these lawmakers who are saying that we need to prepare for war with China? I was listening to a hearing in the House the other day, and I couldn't believe even I couldn't believe what they were saying about sending more and more troops over to the Pacific to surround China. I think we already have about 250 bases. We're opening a new base in Guam, sending 5,000 Marines from Okinawa to Guam, fully militarizing Guam. And yet we owe China money. How do they square this in their mind?
Well, I can tell you I've been engaged in international economics at the professional level for 43 years, and you add some student years in that. I've never seen a worse public discussion and debate than we have right now. It's almost mindless. It's also filled with lies and many other things, but this warmongering against China it's so wrong, by the way. Aside from the question of debt, do we really want to end the world? Do we really want to have World War III with China right now? These congressmen need to get a life, get out of their handouts and hands out to the military industrial funders and the other lobbyists, and go learn something. Go to China, go have some discussions, go see something, because what they're talking is nonsense, and it's going to get us in deep, deep trouble. So when it comes to the question of the drumbeats of war with China, much more than the debt issue and the economy issue, I'm worried about the survival issue. And I just see so much ignorance in Congress, but maybe it's not ignorance. Maybe they're just expert at fundraising for their reelection campaigns, and that's all that matters to them. But I don't think they know what they're talking about at all right now.
Well, I would agree with you on that. I think many of us at Code Pink would agree with you. And there are some of us who believe that this war in Ukraine is really a prelude to what people like Victoria Nuland, number 3 in the State Department, who was there in the Maidan Square in 2014, encouraging the coup and engineered the transition government, want to see, which is the next war with China. God forbid, right? We know that would be an absolute disaster.
Overseas, a lot of people call this the Nuland administration, not the Biden administration, because Nuland has been there. She was Cheney's advisor. She was the Bush ambassador to NATO when the NATO enlargement to Ukraine and to Georgia was put, this disastrous idea that got us into this was put into the NATO agenda, by the way, over the huge objections of the Europeans at the time. She was the ambassador to NATO under the Republicans. Okay, then she stays, and then she's the point person for the U.S. role in the overthrow of the Ukraine government in February 2014 that starts this war, because people need to remember, just get on a website and look at it. Even they're admitting it. This war didn't start in 2022 with Russia's invasion. This war started in 2014 with the violent overthrow of the Ukraine government. And go listen to Nuland on tape several weeks before the overthrow, talking about who the next government would be in Ukraine. She's already plotting this with the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Piot, on a phone call that was intercepted. It's unbelievable. She was then Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs. Now she's Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. So she's that deep state, the one that transcends the political parties, that shows this is not Democrats and Republicans. This goes back to Cheney, to Bush. This goes to Obama administration. This goes right up to Biden. Come on. What is this? And we've known all along. Our own diplomats, William Burns, who in 2008 was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, cabled home, and people can find it online because it was covered by WikiLeaks. They can find William Burns' email cable that says, my God, if we push NATO enlargement, this is absolutely a Russian red line. And the Russians have explained, don't do this, why this is so dangerous. And Nuland, okay, close your eyes, just go ahead, everything will be fine. And not everything's fine. Now we're in the middle of one war and at risk of another war, and nothing is fine. Interest rates and the disruptions from the war and from the sanctions regime continue to operate. So I predict an outright U.S. recession that goes along with the outright European recession. Now, it happens that China also is experiencing a sharp slowdown. Maybe even stronger words might apply. And this also needs to be looked at from many points of view. The United States is in an economic war with China. Have no doubt about it. And it's an awful mistake, in my opinion. But US policymakers are trying actively to harm the Chinese economy. I don't make the accusation lightly. I make it after a cascade of multiple deliberate injuries to the Chinese economy, starting with unilateral trade measures, then unilateral measures on financial flows, on foreign direct investment, both from China into the US market and from the US to the Chinese market. And most recently, in restrictions on exports of US high technology, especially high-end semiconductors, to China. We also tried very hard to break major Chinese enterprises like Huawei and ZTE. This is part of a geopolitical game, but an extremely dangerous game. It is a US version of containment applied to China in the same way that the US once applied it to the Soviet Union. The Chinese don't like it very much, by the way. They don't like the #1 economy in the world saying quite explicitly, we are out to harm the #2 economy in the world. But that is absolutely what's happening. Now, that's also destroying supply chains, undermining confidence, and ratcheting up geopolitical tensions, especially across the Straits of Taiwan. So the US has a two-front war, economic war, one with Russia, one with China, and the disruptions of this war are worldwide. China's economy is definitely hurting from this, and because China is the main trade partner of much of the world, that percolates throughout the entire world. So if you added up the COVID shocks, the war in Ukraine, the sanctions regime, the geopolitical tensions, the tightening of credit by the Fed and the European Central Bank as a delayed response to the massive increase of liquidity in 2020, you have quite a brew. But it's not even limited to that, because there's one more major shock that is hitting the world, and that is the climate shocks that are being felt almost everywhere. And in 2022, almost in an uncanny way, major climate shocks being felt in all of the major regions of the world. The United States just had a massive hurricane, one of the worst landfalling hurricanes in US modern history. The storm continues, but it made 2 landfalls with massive devastation in Florida and in North and South Carolina. We've had drought across Europe, massive failures of rains in Africa. We've had flooding more recently in Europe, massive drought in China, and heat waves and many other side effects of the climate shocks being felt around the world. Now, when you have such a complex concurrence of events, this is when diplomacy is absolutely vital. Many of those supply shocks, even COVID as it continues till today, especially the war, the geopolitical shocks, the management of the fallout from monetary tightening, which will hit dozens of countries trying to repay their debts, the tightening of global capital markets. All of this requires an active, cooperative approach by the major countries. It requires decisions within the International Monetary Fund to be on the liquidity lender of last resort side, to pay absolutely quick and urgent attention to countries in financial stress. It requires the bilateral creditor countries, China and European countries and the United States and others, to work together for recapitalizing debts coming due. It requires cooperation in the international development banks, especially the multilateral development banks like the Inter-American Development Bank, which doesn't even have a leader right now, for heaven's sake, and in other venues, to make sure that there is public financing that can offset declines of private financing. In short, we need the G20 right now to acknowledge that this is the worst economic crisis, certainly since the early 1980s, and it could quickly dwarf that crisis because we have a very hot and very dangerous war underway right now, which we did not have in the late 1970s and the early 1980s in the same way. And so when you add it up, I think that this is the worst situation that we've experienced probably since the end of World War II in terms of dangers. We need cooperation to avoid a contagion of financial crises and to address the underlying sources of these crises, an approach to ending the war on a diplomatic basis, which incidentally could happen if the United States would finally recognize that its attempt to expand NATO to Ukraine and Georgia was a major provocation that led to this extraordinarily dangerous deterioration and the onset of war itself. We need cooperation to continue to push COVID to the end of this pandemic, because we're not done with this pandemic yet. We need the multilateral financial institutions to be acting with alacrity by making larger loans, helping countries to make major structural investments, for example, in green energy, because private capital markets will not make these investments right now. We need provision of liquidity so that countries don't get into debt distress because of contagion, which we know to be absolutely possible in moments like this. And we need to avoid further deterioration of relations between the US and China. It's a large order, and I have to tell you, I'm not very optimistic right now, because I don't see the political will for this, despite the fact that all of the major regions are suffering economically. There's no one that is getting through this crisis well. Not the United States, not Europe, not China, certainly not Russia, nor the developing countries. There's no bright spot that says, oh, well, here's the silver lining. There's only a worldwide crisis that is at risk of getting out of control. So that's the backdrop, and this requires absolutely skilled macroeconomic management for Argentina and countries like Argentina, which actually do not have terrible fundamentals, but don't have any trust in the international capital markets. We need liquidity. We need routine recapitalization of debt. Argentina's trouble, incidentally, is its reputation, not its reality. If you looked at the fiscal balance sheets of the government of Argentina and the federal government of the United States, you'd rather have Argentina's balance sheet. It's got lower debts, it's got smaller deficits, but the fact of the matter is nobody trusts Argentina. And so even when it comes to very, very small amounts of refinancing, it's a crisis. That's what the international system needs to address. That is a market failure, by the way. That is a profound market failure. That's not normal. That is a market failure because our institutions do not address this kind of financial panic or self-fulfilling financial crisis, where a country has a bad reputation, therefore it can't borrow, therefore it has a bad reputation because it can't routinely refinance its debts. If you took away the name Argentina from Argentina's instruments and just showed the balance sheets, the fisc, and all the rest, it would be a pretty big yawn. No one would be too concerned. But since everybody always expects the worst, they often get the worst. And that's the problem that we need to overcome also, self-fulfilling crises. So this is a big mess of a situation. I wish the United States would get back to the business of business and out of the business of war and conflict. The world would be a lot safer. So thank you very much for letting me share these thoughts with you, and back over to you. Well, great to be with you, first of all, and thanks for a discussion of a really important topic, because nobody has quite explained in this debate, whether it's the White House or the Congress, how we got to the situation that we're in. Here are the basic numbers. If you look at the debt that the government owes to the public, not that the government owes to other units of the government, it's something around $25 trillion, not quite the 31 trillion, because some of that is owed to the Federal Reserve, for example. Okay, these are technicalities. 25 trillion is still a big number, and it's nearly 100% of our annual output in the country, which is the gross domestic product. Now, back in the year 2000, the debt that was owed by the government was only 35% of the gross domestic product. So it went from being 35% of national income back in the year 2000 to nearly 100% of our national income today. That's a pretty steep increase. That means that we are spending but not covering that spending by taxes, but covering that spending by borrowing. And obviously we've been borrowing a lot. The point of my article is that really a lot of that borrowing has gone to fund these useless, wasteful, destructive wars. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, now Ukraine. That's awful. And when you look at the estimates by the Watson Institute at Brown University, they say that the cost of these wars is about $8 trillion if you combine them, not even up to today, but up to a couple of years ago. Now, there are some definitional issues and some timing issues that mean that we should go a little bit deeper at the technical level. But the point is that if we had kept our debt at 35% of GDP rather than at 100% of GDP, that is about 65% of GDP, or 2/3 of today's GDP of 24 trillion. You do the arithmetic, that's about a $16 trillion, $15 to $16 trillion increase of debt beyond what would have kept the debt at a level relative to income. So what the Watson Institute estimates are showing is that about half of that has gone to war. I think even more than half has really accounted for by the military, because in addition to the war spending, we're funding 800 military bases around the world. We're funding a bloated intelligence world. We're funding all sorts of things that the military-industrial complex likes, that Raytheon or General Dynamics or Boeing or those that are selling weapons like, but are a waste for the American people. Now, mind you, the other half of that increase of debt came from the 2008 financial crisis, which blew a hole in the budget. That was Wall Street excess, let me put it that way. Another part came from the pandemic. Various things could be said about that. But basically, between war, financial crisis, and the pandemic, that's where our budget was blown. And here's the challenge I would put to President Biden. I'm completely against what we're doing in Ukraine because I think this war could have been avoided. I think it has a lot to do with the U.S. relentless push to expand NATO, which, by the way, is a military-industrial complex lobbying goal. That's what they lobby for. They love selling weapons to new NATO members. They want to keep expanding NATO. And other countries, including Russia, say, stop coming up to our border. Okay. So I think this war could have been avoided, but Biden really is part of the military-industrial complex, has been as a senator, a vice president, now as president. He's always backed NATO enlargement. He's backed NATO enlargement to Ukraine. I think it's been reckless. I think it's the reason we have this war. So I'm saying, okay, if you really want to make a deal, stop this wasteful spending. Get the military budget under control. But by the way, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are talking about this almost at all.
Yes, it's up to us, right?
They're gonna slash the social safety net, which is already in tatters in this country, and then protect the military spending.
Well, so that we can have more war. Yeah, this is what I wanted to ask you about, Jeffrey Sachs, because I know that at one point during this debt crisis, Republicans were adamant about reducing spending. We even had our House Speaker, I'll put that in quotes, Kevin McCarthy promised the Freedom Caucus and promised the American people that we would not issue a blank check for Ukraine. And now we're up to over $115 billion. Half of that, an estimated half, for weapons and military training. The latest being that the Biden has agreed that the United States will train Ukrainian pilots to fly F-16 fighter jets.
Unbelievable, because it's nonstop escalation. More weapon systems, more destruction, more deaths, more spending. And I remember what I wanted to say, which is I would challenge President Biden, if he wants to continue on this path of the Ukraine war, which I think is tragic and completely solvable if he would stop the NATO enlargement and say to the Russians, go home and we don't go into Ukraine. And that's how you end this war. But I'd like him to say, okay, if we're going to spend more money, we're going to raise taxes to do it. Let's put it to the American people. Fund this, not just put it on the debt. And I'd say to the Republicans also, you want the war? Tell the American people they're going to pay more taxes. You want to have a war in Asia with China? Okay, raise the taxes for that. See how the American people feel about that. They don't dare do it. That's why the debt keeps going up, because these wars are not popular at all. And by the way, they don't want to ask the American people their views about anything. So they just put it onto the debt without asking us, do we really want to have this tragic war in Iraq? Do we really want to have a CIA-led operation to overthrow the Syrian government? Do we really want to bomb Libya back into rubble? They never asked us on any of this stuff. And if they just put it onto the debt, but if they said, okay, this is really important, and we're going to raise taxes to do it, then we could have a good debate in this country. Is this really important, or is this good for General Dynamics? Is this good for Boeing? Is this good for the military-industrial complex? We don't have that debate right now because they hide it on the debt.
That's right. And few people realize that the Department of Defense the Department of War, it used to be called, it should still be called, has never passed an audit. That's because there's missing money and people can't explain where this money has gone. And now we're just hurling money, spending about $6 billion to prop up the government in Ukraine, rather than saying, we'll support a ceasefire, we'll sit down, we'll negotiate with Putin, with Zelensky, maybe have 2 tracks of diplomacy, but we want to end this war now. No, instead, Biden has committed the United States to train Ukrainian pilots on these F-16 fighter jets, which could take a year or 2. I mean, that's in essence saying we're committed to further death, destruction, the risk of nuclear war for another 2 years. But let's get back for a minute to the so-called debt crisis, because you're an economist, Jeffrey Sachs. I want answers to a couple questions in the weeds. Okay. So we have this, you say it's a $24 trillion debt. If you really examine it, the media is saying 31 trillion. Anyway, the point is, where are we getting this money? It's debt. Who do we owe it to? How are we raising this money to pay for all of these wars, including the war in Ukraine?
So the government borrows. It borrows from the public. It borrows from foreign governments that hold this debt. It borrows from foreign wealth holders that owe this debt. And to some extent, the borrowing is okay, but we went from owing 35% of our income to 100% of our gross domestic product. And what the Congressional Budget Office signals is that if we keep on the current policies, the debt will rise to around 160% or even higher of our gross domestic product by mid-century. In other words, we're on an upward spiral because no side, neither the Democrats nor the Republicans, want to talk about spending to cover wars and the military budget. Neither one wants to talk about taxing the rich. By the way, that's true not just of the Republicans.
On one hand, you're saying all options are possible, so you don't know what. But on the other hand, you're saying, no, diplomacy does not really work now anymore. So what are the real end result here? So Karl of Clausewitz, he said, a war always pushes to the extremes unless there's a peace agreement or a total defeat of the adversary. Neither of these options are in sight at the moment. So fighting continues. What are these extremes when it comes on? No diplomacy, decision made on the battlefield. Would it creep to an open, all-out war? Is this a possibility, including maybe nuclear weapons?
There are many theories of what's going to happen on the battlefield, but before I get to them, just to say that Clausewitz's most famous observation, I think, applies here perfectly, which is that war is the continuation of politics with other means. This is political issues that we're talking about here, which means that there is a way to resolve these issues politically, not militarily. That's key. If this was the delusions of a madman, this would be different. But this is politics. It's politics about Ukraine and it's politics about NATO. And so this is susceptible of a negotiated outcome. I would not give up on that at all. Now, what could happen? Many things could happen. The one thing that cannot happen, in my opinion, is that Russia is defeated. And the reason is that if Russia were to lose in a conventional sense, I believe Russia would likely escalate to nuclear war. Because my understanding of this issue is that Russia views this issue as existential for Russia, not as haphazard, and not as a flight of fancy, not as a dream world of Peter the Great, not as recreating the Russian Empire, but as an existential threat to Russia. Whether it is or is not, it's viewed that way. And Putin is hardly the hardest of the hardliners in Russia, by the way. There are many who resent the fact that he has not escalated much harder and much faster, which is within Russia's means. So, one possibility is that Russia wins on the battlefield in the next months. This could really happen, incidentally, because in a war of attrition, a much, much larger and powerful country has a propensity to win. And because apparently, although I'm no expert on this, it is said that NATO stockpiles, including US stockpiles, are running very low, that scaling up of US military production will take years, and that even an article in Politico, which is a kind of right-wing daily in the United States, said the Pentagon is freaking out over the depleted reserves because our real war is with China, they say. So it's really possible that Russia has a significant victory on the battlefield. Okay, that could mean all sorts of things. It could mean NATO escalation, in which we ratchet things further, or it could mean that there's some negotiation or frozen lines or armistice or Ukraine divided in two or something else. Okay, that's one possibility. Another possibility is that Ukraine wins significantly in this counteroffensive, although, actually I won't say although, suppose that it did. Is Russia going to say, oh, we made a mistake, we go home? I doubt it. I think Russia would escalate further, and Russia has 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons, including tactical nuclear weapons. I'm told every day, oh, don't be blackmailed by nuclear weapons. People who say that have no idea of the history of the nuclear age. If you're not terrified of gambling with that, you don't know the history. I'm terrified of it. So if Russia were to be losing in a conventional war, I would be terrified right now of what would come next. And the idea that we had a story last week in the Washington Post, by the way, which said Biden, I'm paraphrasing, has decided he can ignore more and more of Putin's red lines because so far it's all been bluff. My God, the best book about the Cuban Missile Crisis ever written was a book called Gambling with Armageddon. That's what they're doing. And I know the people doing the gambling, you wouldn't want to bet the world on them, by the way. I know them personally. Don't bet the world on them. So this is where we are. Lots of things are possible, but one thing that is absolutely possible is that Biden picks up the phone and says, you know, we should consider a way to end this thing without blowing up the world, with you going home, and with NATO not enlarging. That's what I would like to see.
You said nuclear weapons. Of course, Russia might use or might threaten with nuclear weapons, but at the moment it doesn't really seem that Russia will have a decisive victory on the battlefield. So wasn't there a Russian miscalculation in the first place? So Russia did not increase military spending decisively before the war. All other imperial powers did in the history. Russia did not. He invaded Ukraine with 180,000 soldiers. Compared to the US deployed 800,000 soldiers in 1992 in Kuwait to liberate Kuwait. Kuwait is 40 times smaller than Ukraine. So wasn't it as a military miscalculation by Putin in the first place? And now the last option, what remains are the nuclear weapons. Was this not a dangerous gambling on the side of Putin as well.
Aren't we just witnessing a game of chicken on both sides? Isn't that what we're doing? That each side thinks they can bluff the other, and each side calls the bluff of the other. The United States thought that they could get rid of Yanukovych. Well, we are in an enormously difficult environment right now, macroeconomically, and that is true almost everywhere in the world. The crisis is severe and likely to get worse in the short term. The reason is we are battling a number of major disruptions, almost all of them human-caused rather than natural, but nonetheless very difficult and deep disruptions that are continuing to afflict the world economy. And because of the lack of diplomacy, as you mentioned, a theme of my talk, we don't have cooperation to solve these deep problems right now at the global scene. I would say to my friends in Argentina, because Argentina is an important member of the G20, which will meet in November, that is an occasion for Argentina and for other countries to insist that the big powers, the United States, China, Russia, and others, work together to overcome the current crises, because all the rest of the world right now is being profoundly endangered and disrupted by the conflicts among the major countries. We face multiple shocks. This is quite obvious. We face the continuing shocks of the COVID pandemic, which disrupted the entire world economy, deepened the crisis, especially in developing countries, and disrupted global supply chains in a way that continues until today. We know that recovery from the pandemic was incomplete, and especially that the developing countries were lagging behind because the wealthier countries used strong fiscal and monetary stimulus to bounce back from the sharp decline of 2020. But of course, developing countries could not do that. Argentina has no fiscal space at all, obviously, but Argentina is not alone in that. All through the world, other than in Europe, the United States, and a few other countries, the recovery from COVID was actually almost non-existent, not just incomplete. Then came the war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine has been a profoundly disruptive factor, and a very dangerous one militarily, as well as profoundly disruptive economically. Of course, a lot of people are being killed in Ukraine on both sides, but even more ominously, the war continues to escalate, and there is even talk by many countries of the risks of nuclear war as a result of this conflict. And this is extraordinarily dangerous. We have not heard talk like this for 60 years, since the Cuban Missile Crisis, which has its 60th anniversary this very month, because the Cuban Missile Crisis took place in October 1962. When the war broke out in February 24th, the Western countries imposed very heavy sanctions on Russia, with the attempt to use economic means to stop Russia's war abilities. Predictably, this failed because Russia was able to reorient a significant amount of its trade in oil to Asia, away from Europe. But what is quite striking is that the sanctions had a major adverse effect on Europe, a boomerang effect, which put Europe into a recession which is becoming extremely deep. As the war escalated, Russia cut off the flows of gas to Western Europe, and this deepened the crisis in Europe because Europe could not conceivably replace the gas by other international means. Oil, yes, but not gas, because gas comes in pipelines, gas requires heavy infrastructure, and gas cannot simply be reoriented. And so the result was a major supply shock to Europe, first and foremost, but also, of course, to developing countries around the world that suffered a significant increase of food prices, fertilizer prices, and oil and gas prices. So now Europe in a very deep recession, and the United States are probably in recession as well. Now, those supply shocks, which were very serious, both from COVID, the war, and the sanctions, meant that we entered a period of stagflation. This is the first worldwide stagflation in 40 years. It brings back a lot of memories for me because I began my economics career 42 years ago as an assistant professor at Harvard. My dissertation in 1980 was on the supply shocks of the 1970s, and my first published book in 1982 was called The Economics of Worldwide Stagflation. We have a similar constellation of events now as we did in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And one can recall in Argentina, those were not easy years in Argentina in the early 1980s economically. Of course, they were years of hyperinflation, in fact. Now, the reason why the stagflation is so powerful right now is twofold. On the one side, the supply shocks are very strong. On the other side, the monetary stimulus that the Federal Reserve applied after March 2020 was the strongest in our history. The Central Bank of Argentina could only dream of getting away with a monetary expansion like the one the Fed used. The Fed essentially printed $3 trillion of base money. $3 trillion. If Argentina did 1,000th of that, it gets into trouble. But the Fed produced, through massive open market operations that were buying the bonds sold by the Treasury to fund unprecedented budget deficits, increased base money spectacularly. And it was very interesting from a monetary theory point of view. The first effects were only in the asset markets. So the first effects of this huge monetary expansion were a booming stock market. The rich got richer than ever before. Also, other commodities boomed. One evidence of the remarkable monetary expansion was the boom of cryptocurrencies, which in my view have zero fundamental value and zero social value as well, I might add. But Bitcoin soared to $60,000 a Bitcoin because the Fed's expansion was so extraordinary. Non-fungible tokens, NFTs, soared in value. Art soared in value, even as the contraction from the COVID pandemic was taking hold. But then, after about a year, the price increases went from the asset markets into the commodity markets. So we started to see increases of wheat prices, of other grain prices, of copper prices, of oil prices. And you could watch the monetary mechanism working its way through the system. First assets, then commodities, and by now into the core economy itself. That is wages and prices of non-commodity non-commodity goods and services. So the inflation in the United States, nothing that Argentina would even notice. It's up to maybe around 8%. So you might say, my God, that's price stability. But in fact, from a US point of view, it's pretty unusually high. Europe has topped 10% in the Eurozone. And the result of the supply shocks on the one side, which have pushed up commodities and prices, especially of energy and food, and the monetary expansion on the other side, means a full-blown stagflation, as I mentioned, of the first time in the last 40 years. The Fed, to defend its position, now is raising interest rates significantly. The US economy is perhaps already in recession. As you know, we've had, on preliminary data, 2 negative quarters. So one could say a technical recession if the preliminary data hold up. The economy seems stronger than that for the moment, but the Fed is continuing to ratchet up.
Russia wasn't making demands to annex territory. Everything becomes harder when you have war. This is clear. That's why these guys, it's so mindless. And by the way, I think I mentioned to you, I called the White House after Putin put those propositions on the table. I was able to have my say for an hour, but I was told point blank, we will not negotiate over NATO. And I told them, you're going to have war. This is absolutely reckless. So there we are.
Do you get the sense that there is a policy debate now underway in Washington and that the wind is starting to change? I've started to see articles appearing. I mean, there was Mr. Charab. I don't know whether you know him, but
yeah.
He does seem
I
to
don't
be an
know
interesting.
personally.
He does seem to be an interesting man, and he's making some comments now. He talked about an unwinnable war in Ukraine. You get the sense that I get the sense that, of course, this is from London. It's a long way away here in London from what's going on in Washington. But I do get the sense that there are some people who say this is going too far. We've invested too much in this. It is getting too unpredictable. It is going on for too long. And we've had other articles appearing. There was a very I didn't like the article, but it was in Politico about, our military position is depleting, all of those sort of things. I mean, do you get the sense that there is now some doubt starting to grow in some parts of the American government, and that this might eventually lead us back to some kind of a compromise, even if not perhaps quite as coherent a compromise as the one that President Kennedy came to in the 1960s?
So first, it's interesting to say about Rand. Rand is solid U.S. defense. I mean, that's how it was set up for the U.S. Air Force and so on. But interestingly, and I've followed Rand obviously for 40 years, they do honest analysis, which is interesting because there are very few places where you get honest analysis. So that article is insightful. That guy is quite insightful. Rand has been telling us for years, as you've been reporting, and as we know, don't get into a long war. It's not in American interest. And so Rand, I give a lot of credit to Rand for, in the midst of all of this complete mindless politicization, to actually do analysis. This is quite different from, say, British intelligence, what garbage passes for what's claimed to be. This is real analysis. So I think that is first important to note. Washington is so pathetic right now. First of all, it's all geared towards nothing but 2024. So we're constantly in election mode. Election mode means money mode, and it means lobbying mode. So it's never really an honest debate. If there's a debate, it's about what does this mean for Biden's reelection? What should he do for Biden's reelection? It's not an analytical debate. It's not how do we save the world debate. It's spin. What do we say? How do we maneuver? Of course, there are different points of view. A lot of people could see this is not working out very well. But things are driven so relentlessly by very short-term theatrical considerations that I wouldn't give a lot of hope to kind of high-minded rethinking. Who knows? But what I see is a tremendous concentration on spin and on posturing, and that is not conducive to strategy. Incidentally, by the way, even when Kennedy gave that peace speech, he hid the text of the speech from the State Department, from the Defense Department, from the security establishment until the day before, because he knew he did not want the speech stopped. So you have to have really a clever, energetic, properly directed president to begin with. And I don't think Biden fits any of that description right now. To even be able to break free of what is this overwhelming war machine. And you need to have a mind that's somehow above the spin cycle, and I don't see that right now. What I do think is absolutely happening is a consolidation of about 80% of the world in favor of negotiations, and that, to my mind, makes a very big difference. And we've discussed this, and you've been discussing this. The fact that it's not, it's China, that's hugely important. Indonesia, that's not a small thing, by the way, that the Indonesian government put on the table a peace plan. Lula, not unimportant at all, quite important, because Lula brings together the whole leadership of South America. The dynamics in the Middle East, the African leaders saying, come on, you're choking us with this. We need peace. I think what is slowly dawning on the policy types in the United States and Europe is, the world's not with us. In fact, more than that, the world's actually against us. Because for a while they were saying, well, they voted 140 countries, and now they're kind of understanding it's much worse than that. Europe's diplomacy is collapsing internationally. I mean, Europe is viewed as a small appendage to NATO. It's uninteresting for almost all the world because nobody sees anything coming out of Europe except basically parroting the U.S. line. And the U.S. is seen for what it is, which is, most of the world saying, we don't want to be led by you. Thank you. We'd like to trade with you. We'd like to cooperate. We don't want to be bombed by you. Thank you. But we don't want to follow you or have your sanctions regime and so on. And so all of this means that over time, the viability of this whole approach, the U.S. hegemonic approach, the NATO enlargement approach, the war approach, even for the military logistics and armament side, it's less and less viable. I don't think the U.S. will be the first one to break ranks on this, actually, because of our strange, corrupted politics. But I do think that the weight of the world opinion really coming together to say, come on, stop already, is actually going to, one way or another, make the difference. I hope it makes the difference before we get things completely out of hand. And, to come back to where I started, there's in a nuclear confrontation, in a nuclear age, 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons on both sides, a lot of not so very clever people in the U.S. leadership. You just can't be complacent day by day thinking it's somehow all going to come out right, because there are too many stupid people around, too many irresponsible people. That's why I'd like to get us to the negotiations as fast as possible, not give time for what I know is complete irresponsibility. By the way, when I've been at Harvard and trained, I've seen how these people get trained. I want to negotiate. Let me put it that way.